Hi, this is Nicole, and this week I will be taking us through the intellectual history of our readings for the Information Behavior and Information Retrieval Week. The first article we'll look at is Life in a Small World, Applicability of Gratification Theory to Information Seeking Behavior. This was written by Alfreda A. Chapman. So she had a BS in Education, a Master's of Library and Information Science, and a PhD in Library and Information Studies. She was on the faculty at Louisiana State University from 83 to 86, UNC Chapel Hill from 86 to 98, and Florida State University from 1998 until her death in 2002. She was an active member of the Library Research Roundtable during the 80s and 90s and served as the chair for that committee from 1993 to 1994. Chapman's article was published in 1991 in the Journal of the American Society for Information Science. It looked at gratification theory as applied to information seeking behaviors of lower class populations. Some of the main ideas of this were that the perception within these populations was that outside sources were not capable of responding to their concern, and therefore there was little motivation for them to explore those sources. Chapman also found that this population focused more on the present reality rather than long term. And a lot of this kind of can come from the fact that she mainly worked with understudied or minority groups and was one of the first people to address information access and marginalization as a social process. The next article we'll look at is Relevance, the Whole History. This was written by Stefano Mizzaro. He is Italian, and he's a professor of information processing systems in the Department of Mathematical, Computer, and Physical Sciences at the University of Udine since 2006. And about 99% of all the information I can find on him online is in Italian, so I did have a friend translate this for me. So shout out to my friend Lena for being amazing and doing that. Mitsaro's article was published in 1997, and like Chapman, it was published in the Journal of the American Society for Information Science. It was a literature review that looked at the history of relevance in the fields of documentation, information science, and information retrieval. He broke this down into three periods: before 1958, 1969 to 1976, and 1977 to present. He focused on seven aspects: foundations, kinds, surrogates, criteria, dynamics, expression, and subjectiveness, and came to the conclusion that relevance is fundamental. The next reading we'll take a look at is Conceptual Frameworks in Information Behavior. This reading had three authors, so I'm just going to do a brief overview of all of them. So the first author is Karen E. Fisher, formerly Pettigrew at the time of publishing. She has an LIS degree as well as a PhD in Library and Information Science, did a postdoc in University of Michigan, and has been a professor kind of all over the world, it seems. But most of her research has focused mainly on forced migration, information in everyday life, and digital youth. Next, we have Rhea Fidel. She has a degree from Tel Aviv University, a master's in library science from Hebrew University, and a PhD in library and information science from our very own iSchool. She's a professor emeritus at the Washington iSchool and was the former head of the Center for Human Information Interaction. Her research mainly focused on information seeking behavior, information storage and retrieval, and knowledge organization. Our third author is Harry Bruce. He has what I assume is a Master of Library Science and a PhD in Information Science, both from the University of New South Wales. He is a Professor Emeritus and a Dean Emeritus of the Washington iSchool. Much of his research was about human information behavior, information seeking, personal information management, and networked information environments. This work was published in 2001 in the Annual Review of Information Science and Technology, and it looks at some of the conceptual developments in information behavior literature since 1986. It also looks at contextual interplay of cognitive, social, cultural, organization, affective, and linguistic factors and comes to the conclusion that information behavior phenomena are part of the human communicative process. Our next reading is The Theory of Information Worlds and Information Behavior. So this one also has two authors, so I'll do brief overviews for them as well. So Gary Burnett has an MLIS from Rutgers and a PhD in English from Princeton. He is a professor currently at Florida State University in the College of Communication and Information, but he has previously also been an adjunct faculty member at Princeton and at Rutgers University's School of Communication, Information, and Library Studies. He focuses mainly on the intersection between information exchange, social norms, and social interaction in online settings, and looks at textuality and interpretive practices. Our second author is Paul T. Yeager, who has like a ridiculous number of degrees, including a JD, a Master's of Library and Information Science, and a PhD in Information Studies from Florida State University. He's currently a professor here at the UMD iSchool and is the co-director of the Information Policy and Access Center. His focus is on information law and policy, disability and accessibility, information and human rights, the social theory of information, and access for underserved populations, as well as e-government. This work was published in 2012 as a chapter in the book New Research in Information Behavior. It examines the idea of information worlds and looks at that as a framework for examining information behavior in different settings. It was very heavily influenced by Chapman, and you can see that as she's referenced many times throughout the work, and Burnett had previously published work with Chapman, so there was a lot of interest overlap there. It also comes to the conclusion that information behavior is shaped simultaneously by both immediate influences in your own social sphere, as well as larger social influences in a more global sphere. Our final reading is Toward a New Understanding of Immigrant Information Behavior, a survey study on information access and information overload among U.S. Black diasporic immigrants. The author of this article is Anna Ndumu, who has a PhD in information from Florida State. She's also currently an assistant professor at the University of Maryland iSchool. Her focus is on social identity and information behavior, with a particular interest in African, Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Latinx immigrants living in the U.S., as well as library education at historically Black colleges and universities. This article was published in 2020 in the Journal of Documentation, and it focuses on Black immigrants, which is an underserved population, which is kind of a running theme that we've seen in a couple of these so far. But it examined the idea of information overload from this perspective and came to the conclusion that a lot of these people experience information overload due to behavioral, quantitative, and qualitative indicators, and most of them mitigate this by turning to intermediaries or in filtering resources. It also helped establish a scale for measuring information overload. You can also see some of the common threads running through here as she references Burnett, Yeager, and Chapman within this piece. So my three key concepts from this week are when talking about underserved or marginalized populations, these groups may have different information needs and exhibit different kinds of information behavior, and not everything is going to be uniform in textbook. We see this a lot with the Chapman and the Ndumu readings, where they focused on very specific populations and then were able to better understand those groups and avoid generalizing based on the weirdest people in the world. Second idea is information worlds, where information behavior is based on the small worlds, your social group, as well as the larger worlds, like society. My third big takeaway is relevancy. As Mizara would say, relevance is fundamental. My three questions for this week's readings are: what are the populations that you hope to include in your research? Whose voices and experiences are you focusing on? Why are those voices the ones you're interested in and not others? 2, what factors do you think have shaped your information behavior, and how do you see that happening? And 3, were there parts of any of these pieces that felt outdated or out of sync with the world today? And then these are just my references. Thank you for watching, and I hope I was able to highlight some of the common threads throughout these readings.